Great. Thanks very much for having me here. Matt talked about school context and teacher turnover and student achievement at the school level. I'm going to really focus in on the role of school context and teacher effectiveness and teacher improvement. And really what I talk about here today is there's not a lot new, right? We've heard this from Molly earlier. We heard it from Linda. We've heard this time and time again, right? This is a theme of the day about how school context influences teacher effectiveness. But what I want to do is present some evidence from some of the work that Susan and Matt and I have done over the past couple of years that really sort of lays some of the research base we think for this, and to provide some explicit examples from our research that I think can shed some light on these questions. So again, to reiterate some of the sort of where we're starting, I think policymakers seem to view teacher effectiveness pretty narrowly, right? And I guess the way that I'd characterize that is that we think of it as a portable, fixed characteristic of an individual, right? We think of teacher quality. We're trying to improve teacher quality. That means that there are teachers who have quality, and they can take that with them wherever they go. And in this framework, the solution to the teacher quality problem is to bring in high-quality individuals and to remove low-quality individuals from the classroom. And I think that what we argue for is a broader view in this. And so I'll make three main points today. One is that teacher effectiveness, and I should clarify, by teacher effectiveness, I mean this in a very broad way, right? All the things we think about how a teacher might contribute to student learning. Here we'll largely operationalize that by looking at contributions to student test scores. But that doesn't mean that this is the only thing the only way we should think about teacher effectiveness. But the big idea is that teacher effectiveness depends on characteristics of the teacher, of the school, and of the match between the teacher and the school. The second point is that teacher effectiveness develops over time. So it's not that there's a fixed quality of a teacher, but that teachers improve over the course of their careers. And third, and in my view most importantly, the development of teachers over time really depends on characteristics of the teacher, of the school that they teach in, and of the match between teachers and students, between teachers and schools. And so teacher effectiveness is broader than the attributes of an individual teacher. This isn't to diminish the importance of attributes of individual teachers, right? Clearly there are some characteristics that matter a lot, that some folks are just more effective teachers than others. Academic skills matter, pedagogical content knowledge matters, teacher preparation matters, right? There are lots of things about the individual when they come into a classroom that certainly are related to their effectiveness. But they're not the only thing that matters. And so I'll give you one example here from some of our work about how context matters. I think we'll hear later from Bo about the importance of the match between the school and the teacher. So one example, Matt alluded to this idea about student discipline, and I should probably frame this more broadly as promoting an environment in schools that's conducive to learning. Some work that Matt and Susan and I and other folks on the project of the Next Generation of Teachers have done. We interviewed folks in schools in a large urban school district. You know, we heard different stories from teachers teaching in different types of schools. Some teachers in some schools would say, when the student acts out in my class and I send them to the principal's office, they come right back and nothing seems to have happened. In other schools, something happens, and that student's behavior is improved when they come back. And I think one quote that illustrates this idea of the importance of that school environment is from a teacher we talked to at a school that was a relatively high-performing school. While I was teaching at my old school, it was very challenging because I was working with a lot of kids that were court involved. And one day I would have 32 students in my classroom, and the next day that number was down to 20. And as I tried to get to know the kids better, I'd find that a lot of them are in and out of jail, or in and out of DUIs, or there were many issues that were interfering with their learning. And some of them lost interest in learning anything that I had to present because, well, the next day they had to appear in front of a judge, and chances are they were going to be away for a while. At my new school, we have the same group of kids, right? It's not about the kids, it's the same group of kids. But with the support that is in place, we give the kids a certain environment that they want to come back to, even though they may have a court date coming up. It's a positive environment for them to be, so they keep coming. Right? And if we're thinking about measuring teacher effectiveness and thinking about this as a characteristic of the individual, this teacher will be differently effective in these two contexts based on things that are going on about the context, not about the characteristics of that individual teacher. And so to sort of make this explicit, you know, a not very a beautiful figure here, but we can think about this teacher effectiveness as being a sort of function of all of these things, of the attributes of the teacher, of the context they teach in, and of the match, the intersection between those two. And I think we can discuss and argue about the relative size of these circles, and some folks might think it's more about the teacher attributes, and some may think it's more about the context. But I think it's important to recognize that all of these are important, and that context piece is a really central feature to understanding teacher effectiveness. Second point is that teachers improve over time, and teacher effectiveness develops over the course of their career. All right, and we've all heard about this plateau that teachers hit. This is an ingrained idea in the policy world. You know, we have quotes from prominent education figures saying things like, once somebody is taught for 3 years, their teaching quality does not change thereafter. Professional development literature says, how do we ensure that teachers continue to grow and develop their schools rather than plateauing after 4 to 5 years in the classroom, as research has consistently shown. And the point I want to make about this is that Matt and I have done some work on this, and we think that this finding is actually, the research literature presents this as a settled finding, and we think that this is not settled. And the reason is, folks who study this have to make some methodological assumptions that are pretty opaque to try and estimate these returns to teaching experience. And what we find is that the assumption matters an awful lot. And different folks make different assumptions. And what we sort of try and unpack is that the assumption that you make, the methodological assumption, I'm happy to talk more about it if folks are interested, but that the assumption matters a lot. And the past solutions, in some ways, have tended to mechanically create this plateau. And so we find that if we relax these assumptions, we find suggestive evidence that there's improvement throughout the career. And so this is what sort of the image from our model that we find. And I don't want to say we have to make an assumption too, right? So this may not be accurate, but at least what we're trying to argue is the answer is not settled about whether or not teachers plateau after the first part of their career. And what we find, we think, echoes a lot of the literature out there about teaching and what folks who understand teaching really deeply experience. And frankly, this, you know, in my own years in the classroom, right, teachers improve a lot in those first few years, right? I think there's no dispute about that. What we show is that teachers continue to improve on average over much of the course of their careers. In fact, from years 10 to year 30, a teacher improves about 35%. In terms of their effectiveness. So we think this is interesting, but I think that we think this is what's even more interesting. So I should say, we would have a different idea about teacher effectiveness, right? Rather than thinking about it as fixed, but if we looked at teachers at different points in their career. And so I think we think this average piece is interesting. What I think we think is more interesting is this idea that how teachers develop really depends on the context in which they teach. In other words, that average, we might care about it, but what we really care about is how to move up that average, right? How to encourage development or promote development throughout the teaching career for all teachers. And so what Matt and I find is that some teachers improve at greater rates than others. This is not a surprise. And part of this seems to be about characteristics of the individual teacher, but a big part of this seems to depend on the school in which a teacher teaches. In other words, in some schools, teachers continue to improve, and in some schools, that plateau pattern probably is what's existing. There are not opportunities for ongoing and sustained teacher development. And so what we find is that supportive school environments are related to improvements in teacher effectiveness. And so here we plot those same sort of returns to teaching experience over time in 3 types of schools. The blue line are schools that have relatively low working environments, non-supportive working environments. The red line are average teachers, and the green line are teachers who work in schools that have supportive work environments. And so what we find is that in these schools that have supportive work environments, teachers improve at much greater rates over the course of their career. In fact, by year 10, teachers in these schools that have supportive environments have improved 40% more than teachers in schools that have much less supportive work environments. Right? So there seems to be this real role for the school in promoting and sustaining teacher development. So let me give you an example of this from some new work that I'm doing with colleagues of mine at Brown and at Harvard, John Tyler, Mary Lasky, and Eric Taylor. And this is from a program that we're doing, and we talked about researcher-practitioner partnerships earlier. This is a researcher-practitioner partnership with colleagues from the Tennessee Department of Education. And what we're doing is we've co-developed this program. It's called the Instructional Partnership Initiative, and we're working on this with schools across the state of Tennessee. And the idea is really figuring out how to leverage teacher evaluation data in order to drive instructional improvement. So instead of using evaluation to hold teachers accountable, how can we turn that on its head and use evaluation to drive instructional improvement? And the big idea is we partner lower performing teachers with a higher performing partner in the same school, and we partner them up using teacher evaluation data. So in the state of Tennessee, teachers are rated on 19 different skill areas, and we don't just pair up teachers based on your overall a highly effective teacher and your overall a lower performing teacher. We identify specific skill areas. So we look at teachers who struggle in certain areas of practice, and we match them in partnership with teachers in the same school who have demonstrated a history of success in those same areas of practice. And then we encourage them to work together throughout the year, doing things like peer observations, doing things like planning lessons together, doing things like talking about how they could inform their practice, setting goals, things like that. And what we did is we randomly assigned schools. We were working, this is from a pilot study, we did this in one district, and we randomly assigned some schools to get this intervention and other schools not to get this intervention. And what we found was that the schools that got this intervention and that where teachers were encouraged to work together improved student achievement substantially. We found that students in these treatment schools scored about 0.06 standard deviations higher than students in the control schools. And I think even more importantly, we found that the improvements were concentrated among these lower performing teachers, folks who were actually paired with a partner. We found that in terms of observation data, they improved at greater rates in the areas where they were matched. And we found, by and large, that these gains were pretty substantial, right? 0.12 standard deviations is a big gain. We're talking about a couple months of student learning. This is a substantial improvement in teacher effectiveness just by pairing these teachers together, having them work collaboratively, having them work in partnership over the course of the school year. So this is one example of an intervention of a context, a piece of the context that could lead two teachers, very similar in different schools, to have different levels of demonstrated effectiveness. And so, putting this together, if I were looking at two teachers in schools in Providence, Mrs. Smith, who's in Blue Elementary School, and Mrs. Jones, who's in Red Elementary School. Mrs. Smith is highly effective, Mrs. Jones is ineffective. I think policymakers will tend to say that's because Mrs. Smith is an effective teacher, Mrs. Jones is an ineffective teacher. And our real question is, potentially that's true. It could be about this, if I can get the pointer to work here, about this bucket over here. The teacher, their level of effectiveness could be different. But it could also have to do with the fact that these teachers are in different contexts. And it could have to do with the fact that they have a different degree of match between them and them in the school, and that they may have improved at different rates over the course of their career. And some of that improvement might depend on the context, right? So if one of these teachers had this instructional partnership initiative and the other didn't, we would see differences in their effectiveness purely because one of them participated in this program and the other didn't, something that's totally external to the teacher. So here's we think some of this evidence that sheds light on the role of the school context in teacher effectiveness. Thanks very much.